Welcome back, fellow listener, for the fourth part of Saga of Old City. Saga of Old City is one of the first books of Dungeons & Dragons set in the world of Greyhawk, the world of Oert or world of Greyhawk, the first setting ever created for Dungeons & Dragons. It is also the first book written by Gygax and the first book of the Greyhawk Adventures series and the first book of the Gord the Rogue series. Last time we read chapter 6, from chapter 6 to chapter 9. We discover how the war between the Beggars Union and the Thieves Guild finished, and how Gord became a solo thief. Initially with his friend San, but after that solo. A single career, a successful single career. He also studied at the university and he learned a lot of new things, but cut with the words and we go back to the book itself. Then we continue where we left. Chapter 10. Today we read maybe 3-4 chapters. I don't know. There are 35 chapters in all the book, and we are at chapter 10, so 1/3 of the book is of all the novel. But I think maybe 3-4 is the right number of chapters a day. So let's start. Chapter 10. Furl that sodomized sail, you mud-sucking shitfoot! The captain was not one to mince words, especially in the middle of a vicious storm. Aye, Captain, Gord replied, tearing at the flapping compass. He was near to being blown off the barge by the combined force of wind and sail. Nearly blinded by the sheets of driven rain and exhausted, but he obeyed as well as he could. Well, move your blasted buns then! How in hell can I save us all from visiting the bottom with the likes of you crew in this tub? Gord had the sail in hand now, and several others of the Renee crew were helping him to secure it with stout lines so that it wouldn't break loose again. The Renee are humankind would live on the rivers of Oert. Have us there, you blasters! Gord heard the captain shouting in a bellow that managed to defeat the howl of the storm. We need that guff sail to keep her headed. And then a shrieking blast of wind tore away the rest of the sentence. Finished with the securing of the lug sail, he and the others hurried to the hatchway and ducked below deck. Gord didn't invite the man on the tiller, the watch, or the captain during times like this. Conditions in the cramped pitching below deck area weren't wonderful, but at least it was warm and dry. After he left his farewell note at the Villa Nobilis, Gord had headed for the river quarter. Without conscious effort, he took precautions so that his journey will go unnoticed and he will not be trailed by some agent of Arental, the leader of the Thieves Guild. After entering the district of sailors, longshoremen, and teamsters, he made doubly certain by taking specific measures designed to lose any follower. Then he backtracked a bit just for extra insurance. He had left all of his fancy garments behind, and his current apparel was remarkable. No sense in taking chances, he thought, and went one step further. A bit later, Gord strode through the wharf gate, clad as a riverman, sea bag on his shoulder, soft cap pulled low on his forehead to help hide his features, ring nowhere to be seen. It had been easy to locate a Renee lord willing to take on a working passenger. Gord simply approached a likely candidate standing on the dock beside his barge and made his request while gesturing in a sign from the secret language of the Renee folk. The barge master was surprised, but had not asked any questions, and overcharged Gord by only a few coppers. He introduced himself as Miklos, or Miklos, I don't know, I think Miklos. Oh, Miklos. Miklos, okay. The barge had sailed the same day, beating slowly up the Celintan River, headed for the ports of call of the near Div and beyond. Going upriver on such a craft was easy, if somewhat tedious. The barge was some 6 pieces or so wide and not quite 4 times as long. Although it had a shallow draft, less than a fathom unless heavily loaded, so as to enable it to navigate shallow waters and be easily beached. It was equipped with a pair of side keels that were lowered to stabilize the craft when it sailed in deeper waters. The freeboard was quite high, and the rails planked stoutly for protection. The roundish bottom was planked over, as was the back, to provide a secure space for cargo and crew, the latter being the family of the captain. The master, being lord of the barge, dwelt in an above-deck cabin abaft. Smaller versions of this sort of barge had but a single mast. This Gord had observed during his stay with the Renee years ago. Being one of the larger sort, however, the barge of Miklos had a small mizzenmast, as well as the stout foremast. There were nearly 24 souls aboard. Only about half of whom were adults, but all but babes in arms had duties to perform, as Gord learned immediately. Everyone, it seemed, was expected to take a turn at the sweeps when the air was calm or the wind full. Eventually, they had left the banks of the Celintan behind and sailed out onto the deep blue of the Lake of Unknown Depths. The near Div is also called the Lake of Unknown Depths. When they left the green shores of the river astern, Gord had seen the crew getting out their armament. From below came scorpions, heavy crossbows, and jugs of lamp oil. The scorpions, huge crossbow-like engines, designed to propel heavy missiles as large as lances nearly 2 furlongs, were set into their sockets at bow and stern. The normal crossbows were stowed near swivels mounted on the scantlings or planked side rails. Missiles for both were likewise kept inside lockers against the time of their need. Finally, the oil pots were secured in netting along both starboard and port beams. One of the crewmen had informed Gord that the oil would be used in emergencies only, such as when some sea monster attacked and could not be driven off by any other means. The oil would be dumped upon the attacking creature and in the surrounding water, and the torch set to all. The fire risk to the barge was obvious to even so green a lake-farer as Gord. At first, the near Div's azure waters had been as calm as a tranquil pool. Gord had not known how fortunate he had been then. Cursing the lack of wind, he had taken his turn rowing, unaware of the possible alternatives. When the wind began gusting next day, he had first thought himself blessed, but by that evening the heavy pitching and rolling of the barge had made him terribly sick. The night had been sheer torture, but next morning was worse. The wind howled around him at near gale force. The cold was acute, which caused him to shiver and made him feel even worse. As bad as Gord felt, it occurred to him that the vessel seemed to be even sicker than he was. Its rigging shrieked as sails and lanyards were stressed to their limits. The barge tossed and seemed likely to founder at any moment. Then Gord stopped thinking about his own misery, as the storm struck in full force and the wind got even stronger. He had to do so many things that he forgot his seasickness. Now that things were well secured above, he was able to rest for a bit here below deck. He dropped into his hammock and fell asleep quickly, despite the motion, smell, and noises from the children and adults also in the place. It seemed that he had just closed his eyes when a hand was shaking him awake again. Time to take his turn bailing. The scow seemed to be full of leaks, but of course it was simply the strain of the rogue water upon her boards. The Rene were clever folk, Gord observed. A system of pulleys and ropes was set up so as to make bailing the barge more efficient. One or two of the crew worked at emptying the bilge with leather buckets. The contents of these they poured into a trough that slanted to where the pulley system was. Another crewman, a child actually, stationed there opened and closed the gate to fill buckets circling the cogs. Each canvas vessel tipped its contents out into another trough that ran from barge to lake through the cabin window. Collapsed, the bucket returned and was soon beneath the trough ready for another outpouring. While a lot of the water spilled to the planks and returned to the bilge, most of it was emptied thus. Two women operated the lifting rig, and Gord was one of three men now plying buckets to empty the bilge. It was back-breaking work. Bilge, I think, not bilge. Bilge. The spring tempest died suddenly, around noon. It had driven the barge well out into the near div and caused a fair amount of damage to hull and rigging. The small boat that had been towed astern was gone, lost who knew where. The Rene set to work immediately, repairing the damage, running new cords and lines, and setting up the artillery with new strings and ropes. The captain was everywhere, ordering this, commanding that, and taking a personal hand whenever things didn't look right to him. The craft was under full sail now, running southeast toward the shore some 10 leagues distant according to Jano, a fellow of about Gord's own age. Sorry, I misread. How he knew this, Gord had no idea. Why are dry strings being put on the crossbows? Why are the quarrels being set out? Gord asked. Jano grinned. They must like to check the surface after a big storm. Lots of good stuff for them to eat then, he said. Gord suddenly felt sick again. No wonder Lord Michaelos was in so much of a hurry to make the coast. The deep waters were certainly no place to be now. He redoubled his efforts at ridding the weaponry, simultaneously regretting his decision to travel by water. All to no avail. The worst happened almost immediately. "Ahoy, Captain Michaelos! Critter off the stern and coming fast!" The warning came from the boy posted by the tiller watching for critters. It was some critter, Gord thought, as he got his first look at the looping coils and huge head of the monster chasing the vessel. Critter, indeed. The spear casting machine at the rear of the barge was already being loaded and wound back even as Gord stood and stared at the creature. So this was one of the dreaded sea serpents he had heard about. It was now about 200 yards distant, coming closer with each heaving motion of its snaky body, with toothy maw agape. To Gord, its mouth seemed large enough to bite the stern clean off the barge. Michaelos shoved the gawking young man aside so that he could get to the scorpion and aim it himself. Gord came out of his shock and followed. Somebody handed him one of the wood-varied missiles for the great crossbow. Gord took it with him to a place near the captain. The monster had closed to about 150 yards now. Michael peered intently along the shaft of the missile, a lanyard in his left hand, his right moving the scorpion so that the barbed iron spearhead pointed directly at the oncoming creature. Michael suddenly twitched his left hand, the steel arms of the scorpion sprang forward, and the pointed lance flashed out with a deep twanging sound. To Gord's untrained eye, the missile seemed to appear magically protruding from the monster's neck, a couple of feet below its head. "Got the snake, son of a bitch!" shouted the helmsman. The thing let forth a bellowing hiss that would have deafened anyone close to it. At just over 100 yards distant, it was awesome. A crewman snatched the missile Gord was stupidly holding onto as he got transfixed by the sight of the creature. The crewman hastily loaded the great lance into the scorpion, while cursing Gord for being a fool and worse. Gord, shame overcoming his terror for a moment, could not disagree. Within seconds, the big machine was again loaded and winched out, and the captain was aiming the second missile. "This time you eat my toothpick, stinking shitmouth!" Michael shouted as he shot the huge bolt at the serpent. The missile struck the head, but the thing was covered with thick scales as large as Gord's hand. These scales turned the point, and the shaft caromed off into the air. A swarm of buzzing whorls from the heavy crossbows followed the larger bolt, and most of these likewise inflicted no apparent harm upon the creature, although a few struck home. Gord was appalled to note that the thing was now close enough for him to clearly see the shafts protruding from its head and neck. It was a blackish-green in color with large fishy eyes. Its snake-like body was propelled by a lashing tail and huge fins. The monster's neck was at least 20 feet long, and its head was like a cross between the snakes and the crocodiles. How could so many teeth fit into one mouth? Gord wondered, and how could they be so large? The monster was at least 100 feet long. Instinctively, he drew his long dagger and hefted it. If it was going to be dinner for the thing, at least it'd give the bastard something to remember him by. Another missile from the scorpion struck the great serpent full in its open mouth. It roared again, snapped its jaws shut, and spat out bits of splintered shaft. Yellowish blood oozed from its mouth, too. This missile had done some damage. More quarrels struck it, and several javelins too, but the serpent's advance was not slowed. The captain was doing his best to manage one more shot from the scorpion before the monster fell upon the barge and destroyed it. Women were screaming somewhere behind Gord, and children were wailing at the top of their lungs. What was going to happen next was obvious to all. The monster was no more than 20 yards distant when Michaelos got his last missile ready and aimed. He released it without hesitation, almost as if he wasn't bothering to aim. The bolt struck the creature's eye directly in the center of the huge green pupil. The resulting bellow of pain from the monster drowned out all other sounds, and its rush for the barge took on new energy. As it came so close that its reeking breath and slimy stench nearly overwhelmed Gord, he hurled his dagger with every ounce of strength he had, aiming for the serpent's remaining eye. A virtual cloud of whorls, javelins, and other missiles accompanied the dagger, for this was the last moment before doomsday. As if in slow motion, Gord saw his weapon turning lazily in the air, pommel under, blade over, slowly revolving to present the slender point to the onrushing eye. Shafts of whorls and javelins protruded as pins from a cushion, for at this range it was difficult to miss, and the scales were less effective protection. Then the dagger met its target. At the same moment, the monster's neck lashed forward and its great jaws snapped. A helpless Rennie was cut in half by the saw-edged teeth, and blood spattered everywhere. What happened next, Gord wasn't sure of. The serpent collided with the barge, and the force of the impact hurled him from his feet. God had struck something, and the next thing he knew, he was being ministered to by a fat woman whose breath reeked of garlic. When he asked what was happening, she said only that they were in a safe harbor and they should rest. God had no choice in the matter, for he abruptly passed back into unconsciousness. A few days later, God was up and around, feeling fine. Yano told him all about the conclusion of the matter. Blinded, the Sea Serpent could do little but rush about erratically in its efforts to destroy its victims. The initial impact had badly damaged the stern of the barge, but it also sent the vessel shooting away, even as the shock of its wounds had caused the monster to recoil. Two of the Rene had been killed by the collision, one crushed to death by the serpent's massive body, the other overboard and drowned, probably. In addition to the unfortunate who was cooked in the monster's jaws. Everyone not holding fast to something embraced had been thrown flat by the force of the creature hitting the vessel, but in a moment most of the crew were back on their feet and shooting again. Was the serpent mortally wounded by them? They will never know, for its writing and splashing on the surface had attracted something else. Yano had seen something huge and dark rise beneath the Sea Serpent, and then the wounded monster had suddenly been jerked beneath the ochre-stained waves, gone without a trace. Everyone aboard was happy that whatever could take it so easily was satisfied with that meal. They patched the stern sufficiently to allow them to make for shore and safety in Cavern Cliff Cove, one of the secret places the barge folk wintered in. The small bay was on the eastern tip of the land that surrounded near Dives Mid Bay. The vessel had made port without further trouble and had been there for a week. It astonished Gord to learn that he'd been unconscious for so long, but he wasn't worried. His head was sore where it had been gashed, and he knew that his scalp would always bear the scar of the encounter. He did feel pride in having been part of the fight against the monster, and that his own skill with the dagger had been vital to survival of the whole Rene family aboard the barge. Because of that skill, Gord now had a place of honor in the group. Everyone, Gord included, seemed to have forgotten about his gawking and his hesitation during the early stage of the battle, and the bargers enthusiastically acknowledged him as an adopted member of the Rene tribe. There were only 5 other barges at the place, for with the advent of warm weather, most of the barge folk had set forth on their travels. Those 5, however, joined in the celebration Miklos held. At his first opportunity, Gord asked the lord of the barge for more information about the creature that had come so near to finishing them all. What do you call those things anyway? He inquired. Big bastards, Miklos replied. No, I mean, what is its actual name? Shit, I've never seen anything like it before, Miklos responded. Nor as big as that, either. Gord didn't feel quite so cocky after that short exchange. He realized fully that a lot of good luck had assisted them, and their missiles had been only a part of it. Anyway, he was still alive to tell about it, and that was the important thing. With that, he dismissed the whole affair and concentrated on the celebration. There was all sorts of food and drink, singing, music, and dancing. Gord scrutinized all of the younger women, thinking that chance might have it that Adaz, the girl he'd met and liked as a boy when he first stayed with the Rene, would be among the folk from the other barges. There were several strikingly pretty girls in the crowd, and all returned his scrutiny with bold looks. This, in turn, brought him black looks from any number of the men there, and when he noticed this, Gord quickly quit his flirting. A fight would not be the way to end a feast celebrating victory over a sea monster and his adoption into the barge folk tribe. But even though he now kept his eyes elsewhere and conversed only with the men around him, the damage had been done. As Gord was lifting his goblet to drink more of the harsh red wine the Rene favored, it was struck from his hand. On your feet, dog! Now that you are one of us, I can challenge you to the test of the blades. A tallish, muscular fellow stood before him, legs spread in an aggressive posture. Piss off, countered Gord. Why should I want to fight you? Are you a coward? The Rainier replied, shouting. Also the way you looked at Estrella, and the way she returned your lustful gaze. She is my woman. Honor demands that I fight you for her. Now! Just as he was about to suggest that the fellow bugger his honor and go pick a fight with his woman, Michael stood up and shouted back at the challenger. Are you calling the family of Michael skirts? Are you saying that we have no pride? Pig! He bent down, grabbed Gord by his blues, and pulled him upright. He will fight, and he will teach you manners. Crap, said Gord under his breath. What was that? Demanded Michaelos. I see that the man is creeped, and a stinking yellow mongrel who cannot beat even a large child in a fair fight, Gord hastily replied. Good! Teach him a lesson! Shouted the captain, even as Gord's opponent was reaching grimly for the dagger on his white belt. Gord could feel the celebrants in the immediate area moving back to make an arena for the impending fight. Too bad for Gord that he had only his small sheath knife. The great dagger he had thrown into the Sea Serpent's orb was somewhere in the waters of the lake, or more probably lodged in the intestines of some leviathan. According to the test of the blades, which he had heard about from his barge mates, Gord must face his opponent with whatever weapon he had. At least its point was sharp, and its edge keen. Be careful, brother, hissed Michaelos, speaking nearly in Gord's ear so that the others nearby could not hear. Zoltan is young, but he is one of the best daggermen in the whole tribe. Gord heaved a long sigh. Thank you, my lord, he replied sarcastically, out of the corner of his mouth. The remark was lost on Michaelos, for he had turned away and was already busy with active betting going on. Someone came out of the crowd with a leather tongue and tied it to the left wrist of the combatants, so that they were separated by about a yard when the cord was stretched out. In the instant after this man stepped back, Zoltan swept his dagger through the space between them. Gord reacted well, but not quickly enough to prevent Zoltan's blade from tracing a stringing path across the front of his blues, breaking the skin beneath, but doing him no great harm. So, to Gord, this is how we begin. As he circled his opponent warily, Gord could just barely distinguish the voices shouting out the odds. In the space of the few seconds following Zoltan's opening swipe, they had risen from 7-2 all the way to 10-1 in Zoltan's favor. Even though concentrating hard on the matter at hand, Gord could not help but feel indignant at that. Hell, one little slash across his belly didn't mean he'd lost the duel. The rules of the ritual dictated that if either combatant cut the tie that held them together, then that person was considered the loser and must either pay the winner a dozen silver nobles or be outcast. Gord actually considered slashing the tongue and ending the contest, for what did a few coins mean? But the backing of his new family kept him at it. Gord assumed that they had wagered everything they owned on him, judging from their shouts of encouragement and their catcalls about Zoltan's ability. He had to go on, even though it looked bad. Michaelos expected him to prove himself worthy. The years of schooling he had undergone would now be put to a real test. These conditions were almost the same as those prescribed in practice matches with less lethal weapons, but he wished they were using swords rather than shorter blades. Gord was a better swordsman than knife fighter, took not by much. Slash and stab, parry and thrust. The match went on for minutes, but seemed like it lasted hours. Both contestants were sweating from strain and exertion, but Gord marveled to himself that the tension was not actually affecting him, and that he was still feeling fresh and ready. He moved with fluid ease and was unwinded. Zoltan, on the other hand, seemed to be tiring a bit. He was panting and moving his legs as if they were heavy. Interesting. Gord stepped up the pace with a flurry of feints, movements, and actual attacks, intermixed with much circling design to keep Zoltan on the move. He was cut twice more in the process, but both wounds were merely scratches, although they must have appeared worse to the audience from the sound of their reactions to the touches. He now heard someone offer odds of 12 to 1, but no cry of acceptance followed. Rat! Now suddenly Zoltan carried the fight to him, stamping forward, his blade moving with blurring speed. Gord danced back, parrying wildly, saving himself barely, and taking a cut on his weapon hand in the process. Now his grip would be less sure, for the blood flowing into his palm would make the handle of his small knife slippery. It was certainly time for him to come up with a winning attack or be beaten, and either shamed or killed. Zoltan was most certainly tired from his furious onslaught. His breathing was labored, and he was gulping air as often as he had the opportunity. When he eased his attack a bit, Gord again countered with his own series of cuts, rushes, and so on. He feigned exhaustion also, and gradually slackened the pace of his offense. The bigger man thought he saw his opportunity and went for it. Zoltan jumped forward suddenly, body crushed low, right arm looping forward, dagger set for a killing thrust into the kidneys or gut. But Gord wasn't there when the attack ended. He had suddenly leaped back as far as possible, pulling out on the leather tongue with all his might. Zoltan, off balance, continued forward and fell heavily on his face, his left arm extended by the thigh, dagger likewise before him. In a flash, Gord leaped atop the man, looped the tongue around his neck, and poised his knife at the edge of his throat. "Who is it, dog?" he asked. "Not my brother, Gord," came the strangled reply from Zoltan. "I am yours, then, Gord." Sorry, wrong voice. This is a girl. I didn't know it. "I am yours, then, Gord," cried the Renee girl Estrella, rushing to his side. Whoa, how rapidly! She betrayed him in a blink of an eye. Okay, end of chapter 10. Whoa, the Renee girl. Okay. No comment. That was different times. Strange. So a brief intermission, and then we proceed with chapter 11. Be patient. Okay. You drink some water, you relax your mind, then we can continue. Okay? Let's go with another chapter. Chapter 11. What do you mean I can give her back? Gord said with surprise, but in a low voice. I didn't want her in the first place. It will be a mortal insult to Zoltan, Estrella, and the Renee Code, Yano told him. Every hand will be turned against you if you did. But I don't want Estrella, not that she isn't desirable. Gord hastened to add, casting a glance toward where his prize sat a few paces away. Why can't I just make a present of her to Zoltan? I could say that I've taken a holy vow of celibacy. No women allowed. Stop talking like an outsider, brother Gord of the Renee. We have no such silly thing as celibacy amongst the true folk. Gord tried another attack. Zoltan will be my enemy forever, unless I return her to him. Pooh, Yano sniffed. He's your sworn enemy for life now. That much is true. It would be a good insult to cast Estrella back at him, but that will not suit it, Zoltan, and it will bring everyone else down on your head as well. Wait, I have it. I have it. Have what? God asked, finding it hard to keep the volume and tone of his voice under control. The solution, stupid! You can solve the problem easily. Do you have silver? You need at least 50 silver pieces to do it. Damn it, Yano! Do what? Get rid of Estrella and let Zoltan know that you think he is worse than pig shit. All you have to do is kill her. The silver will pay off her family, and at that God was up and gone. He strode over to where Estrella was sitting, took her arm to help her up, kissed her, and marched the beaming Renee girl off toward the barge of his family. This brought a cheer from the assemblage of onlookers, at least those who weren't too drunk by then. God resigned himself to his fate. He now had a woman, whether he wanted one or not. Zoltan, meanwhile, stood in the background glaring daggers at both. Somehow, to God, the fellow betrayed something more than hatred, however. Was that a hint of relief he saw in those sullen eyes? Completing repairs and finishing the celebration took another week. The 6 barges at Cavern Cliff Cove were joined by several others in the interim, and most of the original ones left within a few days. As surely as if directed by the fates, the first new barge to arrive bore none other than Adaz, his friend from his earlier days with Renee. She was now mature and more lovely than God's remembrance of her. She was delighted to see him too, at first. God, you have grown so big and strong and handsome, Adaz cried when they first met. She ran a hand over his muscular arm. God flushed at that and murmured vaguely about having had to do much growing up. And you, Adaz, you are as beautiful as ever, he finished somewhat lamely. Thank you, God. I know that you mean it too. Why else would you have come all the way from Grey Oak just to find me? They talked a bit, casually, as Adaz linked her arm in his and stared him toward the community encampment. It was all downhill, in a manner of speaking, after that. When she saw Estrella and learned of the fight with Zoltan, she shunned God entirely. That made him sad and furious at the same time. Don't worry, Yano reassured him. As soon as you become a chief man in the tribe and you have your own barge, then you can have as many women as you can keep. Worst of all, Estrella was a nag and a bitch. She was pretty, but the constant whining tone in her voice drove Gord mad. And every opportunity she was after him to get her presents, jewelry, clothing, and a number of things she must have, all of it she assured him to enhance Gord's status, of course. When she wasn't on that deck, Estrella was urging him to get rid of Zoltan, challenge Michaelos for lordship of the barge, take her to some rich town, and so on and so on and so on. If she caught him looking at Adaz or any of the other young girls, or even thought he might wish to look, she would verbally abuse him or physically attack him, scratching, biting, hitting, and kicking him until he had to subdue her. Beat her more frequently, Michaelos advised sagely. This book is not very family friendly, okay? It's the book, not me, sorry. Gord was certain that Zoltan was somewhere nearby, logging. Every time he looked up from a scene with Estrella, he saw the fellow's back as he walked away. Zoltan's shoulders were either shrugging or shaking with mirth, and God knew there was no reason for him to shrug. In desperation, he sought out his archenemy one day when Estrella was busy elsewhere. You won, Zoltan, said Gord. Oh, well, I know that, Gord. I don't wish to be your enemy, Zoltan. Let us put this behind us and be friends. Zoltan did the shrug then. That you did me two great favors, it's true. You spared my life when it was yours for the taking, and you made it worth living by ridding me of Estrella. I will kiss you, if I could, but our custom dictates I must now be your foe. However, you need never worry that I shall again try to kill you, friend Gord, because if I did, that bitch will be mine again. His darkly tanned face split into a huge log at that, head thrown back, white teeth showing. "You are a funny bastard, aren't you, Zoltan?" That only made him look harder. Gord walked away while Zoltan fell over on the ground, holding his sides, tears streaming down the sides of his face, lost in helpless gales of mirth. So much for that idea. Yano eventually came up with another suggestion, one that appealed more to Gord than his friend's first idea had. If Gord caught his woman in a compromising position with another of the tribe, he could either demand a duel with the fellow, or else he could insist that the violator take the woman and pay him silver in compensation. How in the devil Gord could manage to find anyone foolish enough to want to have anything to do with a shrewish Estrella was his problem, but there was the solution. Again fate stepped in and took a hand. 3 barges filled with a clan who came only infrequently to this spot arrived the next morning. Wonder of wonders, they contained quite a few handsome young bucks who had never met Estrella, nor heard of her evidently, for they casually but frequently shot her concupiscence looks. Gord was careful not to let on that he was not icing. Whatever he did not wish to have to fight yet another duel over her, but he did not want to appear totally unconcerned, so he made a point of glaring at her vigilantly from time to time when she was not, at the moment, involved in flirtation. Estrella, in turn, smiled and winked back at several of the new young men any time she thought Gord was unaware of her. That night, as the assembled family sat around the evening fire singing and dancing as usual, Gord pretended to drink much wine. As he grew more boisterous and seemingly in his cups, Estrella encouraged him to drink more and have fun. After an appropriate interval, Gord got up, swaying in his best drunken imitation, and stumbled and staggered off to the bushes to sleep. The sounds of crashing, followed by loud snores, gave Estrella all the incentive she needed. She quickly moved to where she could talk with the newcomers, especially the handsome young ones. Gord got up from his berth in the bushes and moved silently to the edge of the clearing, from where he could observe everything. After a short time, one of the newcomers strolled off into the foliage. Minutes later, Estrella, trying to move inconspicuously, left the group and took the same path. That was all Gord needed to see. He made his reappearance, went straight to where Miklos and Yano were seated, and whispered something to both of them. They rose and went off with Gord in the same direction Estrella had taken. After creeping carefully through the underbrush for a couple of minutes, the 3 of them caught Estrella and their lover in the act. Gord was outraged. He shouted and stormed. Estrella let out a scream, then began to weep and wail. The younger René was pale in the moonlight, for he had heard that Gord was a renowned fighter, and he undoubtedly thought that he would soon demand a duel to the death over the violation of the beautiful Estrella. The young fellow's family gathered quickly, and his lord conversed softly with Miklos, talking about the time and place for the fight. "This is too much," cried Gord, putting an end to all the talk about fighting. "Never will I cast eyes upon you again, woman." He spat at Estrella, then he turned abruptly to the fellow and added in an almost offhand tone, "Well, where is my silver?" A couple of days later, richer by 25 nobles and the lack of a woman, Gord was aboard Miklos' barge, which was heading along the coast of Neardiv with 2 other barges. They were bound for Leukish, the Radigas city, and whatever lay beyond. Gord was finally going to see something more of the world besides water. It was a relief to make their first port Leukish. Sorry, it's pretty hard to read. I don't know if Leukish. Without having to face anything on the trip more terrible than a pair of playful giant otters who swam near to see them. Since the animals were no threat to them, the barge folk simply ignored the otters and sailed on. There was little to do but loaf and fish until they arrived at the southeastern end of Neardiv and put into port. My digestion. Lyukish was a small city compared to Greyok, even though it was the largest in the Duchy of Ernst and the capital of the place. Ernst was a place of rolling green hills, at least based on what Gord had seen from the barge as it passed along the shoreline. The city of Lyukish was nestled amidst the surrounding hills, although the section farthest from the port area was built on a low plateau so that it dominated the wide valley around it. The people did not look much different from those in Greyok, being a mixture of Oeridians and Solois, although they dressed quite oddly. Gord thought the long trousers were inferior to the hose typically worn in his own city, and the plates and checks that the armsmen sported seemed either plain or gaudy, depending on the hues and arrangements. Ernstmen, not Ernstmen, but Ernst, Duke of Ernst. Architecture was strange here too, for the buildings all seemed tall and narrow, with pointy arches and square towers. Columns and pillars were everywhere. Roofs were steeply peaked, as were the tower caps. All in all, he could hardly wait to get into the place and find out just how different it was. Michaelos warned him that the Ernstmen were not fond of Renee folk. There had been some trouble in the past, with the Ernstmen claiming that the barge folk practiced piracy, sneak raiding, and wars. Some actual battles had been fought, but the whole thing had sort of blown over during the past years. The Duke had troubles elsewhere, and the Renee had no wish to try conducting a war with the Duchy. Gord was instructed that, whatever the circumstances, he should be careful, cautious, and polite during his stay in this territory. He mustn't be caught stealing. Kidnapping was forbidden. Seduction was frowned upon. Gord asked if there was anything else. Yes, the barge folk captain replied. Give me those silver nobles you extorted from the foolish young fellow who relieved you of Estrella. What? Why? Gord demanded. Why should I? The cash is mine. I am your family lord, Michaelos countered. Besides, I have no money of my own. How could you be penniless? Gord was truly at a loss. Michaelos stared at the deck. All the money your family owned was lost betting on Zoltan, he confessed. The gate guard. Really? He bet on Zoltan? God, you have a loving family now. Okay. and he fight only for them. Okay. The gate guards eyed Gord most suspiciously, asked him a couple of questions in an oddly stilted common, and then allowed him to pass into Lyukish. The city was bustling with activity, and Gord simply drifted with the traffic, studying everything he saw. Soon he arrived in a rectangular marketplace filled with carts and booths. His practiced eye noted that there were no discernible thieves loitering about, although some may have been working. Of that he could not be sure. The people here were mostly Earthmen, with a smattering of outlanders and demi-humans. The goods were typical of such a fair, ranging from all manner of foodstuffs to clothing and household goods. Knowing that the interesting items would be at the far end near the largest buildings, Gord went in that direction. Sure enough, there were the metalsmiths. After spending a considerable amount of time examining various dirks and daggers, Gord was quite disappointed. The weapons were finely wrought, but they just weren't the equal to the blade he had lost during the battle with the sea monster. The grizzled seller of weapons at the last stall noted Gord's intensity in examining the poniards, did his best to help by extolling the virtues of each dagger, and then seized the sales pitch with the following advice. You seem you're a connoisseur of such blades. These are all excellent daggers, but what you seek is not here. I suggest you go to the shop of Engel. If you can meet his price, you will have your weapon. Where is this Engel's establishment? Asked Gord. Following the directions of the fellow soon brought Gord to the narrow way leading to a close, as it was described to him. There Gord saw a busy smithy and a shop beside it. The forge was working arrowheads, so he passed immediately into the store. A gnarled old dwarf of great size for one of his sort was there polishing weapons with an oily cloth. Sorry. I need to... crock. Good dog, he said to Gord. Out to server, an clad stranger from Wild Coste? Grey Hook, actually. I'm here for a dagger. Yeah, sure, the dwarf exclaimed enthusiastically. Big, little, long, short, narrow, broad, and more. We got them all. Which? Sorry, he talked with the V instead of the W. So, which? To simplify the process, Gord launched into a detailed description of his lost dagger. He carefully explained its size, shape, decoration, and balance. When he completed the exposition, the dwarf asked some additional details that surprised Gord, for the fellow was accurate in the suggested conformation and decoration of the weapon. And now their weapon is... Gord recounted the tale of the Sea Serpent's attack and defeat. At the point where he told about casting his dagger into the monster's eye, the dwarf shook his head sadly. The blade he informed Gord was most certainly a magic one, but a weapon designed for demi-humans, not folk such as Gord. Had he only been able to have one for himself, Engel said, Gord could have had this pick of the other magic daggers in his place. One what? Gord inquired. Oh, said the dwarf sadly. The long-toothed one you was telling about. Never having heard of a long-toothed one before, Gord found it hard to share the dwarf's sense of sadness, although he keenly regretted losing the dagger and was excited at the prospect of replacing it. I'll show what I do have, Engel said. Then he paused in his rush toward a cabinet. You pay me gold, or is there a deal to be a trade? He eyed Gord's clothing suspiciously as he asked these questions. Without thinking, Gord reached into his sash and drew out the leather bag in which he kept his wealth. His whole attention was so caught by the weapons that he actually shook the bag's contents out onto the counter. The dwarf's eyes fell greedily upon the outpouring, a small pile of platinum and gold, with only a couple of electrum and silver pieces intermixed. Atop all was the cat's eye ring. So, Engel could hardly tear his gaze from the metal. You have much wealth for one so young. He finally managed to look up at Gord, avarice filling his eyes with brightness. Now I show you all. Too late to rectify his mistake, Gord thought. What a fool to display the contents of one's purse to anyone, let alone a dwarf. There was no help for it now, and he must be ready for anything. Engel had the cabinet open and was hastily rummaging around inside it. He turned, arms loaded with parcels wrapped in velvet. He placed all of them on the counter near Gord's heap of coins, unwrapping each of them quickly but carefully. There were 5 daggers there, each beautifully fashioned, each in its own sheath. You choose which you want, the dwarf said, and I tell you how much. Gord bent over and let his eyes play back and forth over the array, not touching any of them right away. While he was so occupied, Engel scampered to the door, barred it, and dropped its curtain, saying, No sense in letting anyone bother you while you is choosing. Gord was ready to grab one of the weapons and defend himself against attack, but the dwarf merely came back to the counter and stared at the coins. When Gord hefted the first of the blades, it began to glow, and he nearly dropped it in surprise. His exclamation caused Engel to shift his gaze away from the coins to see what was going on. Der Lungtoothed one never did that, 'cause you ain't a demi-human, the dwarf said matter-of-factly. This short explanation completed. The dwarf returned to his loving contemplation of the money, and Gord resumed the inspection of the daggers. He definitely did not like a weapon that shed light when it was drawn. Too much attention there. Even though Gord could see advantage to such illumination at times. The second blade was of deep black metal, very sharp and deadly looking, but Gord noticed it had a few teeny pits on it. That one he replaced in its sheath, grateful for his keen eyes, and also set aside as an undesirable. Of the three remaining, all but one glowed when held unsheathed. The last weapon he handled had beautiful balance, and it was almost as large as the one he had lost. Gordon noted that its blade was covered with silver inlaid runes, and his hand tingled slightly when he grasped the dagger and held it in fact in position. He tried a few passes with it, imagining an opponent before him. "Such an eye you have," Engel said. "You hold the best of my daggers." His deep brown eyes sat above the great brush of beard. Engel stared solemnly at Gord and added, It has their Dwemer, so that it ignores armor, und..." "What's Dwemer?" interrupted Gord. "Magic, spells und such." Spells and such. The dwarf said a bit crossly. "Don't be stupid." Engel's accent was getting worse. Gord thought to himself. He meant Dwemer, as in Dwemer Crafter, a spellbinder. The dwarf must be losing his composure because... Spellbinder. The dwarf must be losing his composure because of his fascination with the precious blade in Gord's hand. "Tell me more about this weapon," Gord said firmly. Engel took it from him and unceremoniously hurled it at the stone floor. Much to Gord's amazement, the point went in, and the blade buried itself 2 or 3 inches deep. The dwarf broke into a faint smile as he beheld Gord's shocked expression, then said, "Stone, steel, whatever, their blade sees only like it was flesh. Oof, magic protections is another story, but the minor devil is sliced mid-easiness. You have just enough here to buy it, too." It's damn tiring reading this dwarf. The dwarf was fast, but not as quick as his customer. As Engel's hand darted for the treasure on the counter, Gord's small knife intercepted it, guarding the ring-crowned pile. "Not so fast, my friend," said Gord coolly. "I didn't say I wanted to buy it." He looked at the greed written across Engel's face, shook his head, and continued, "No, at such a cost I am not at all interested." He scooped his treasure back into his purse, pulled the drawstring shut, and turned for the exit. "I shall look elsewhere. Goodbye," he concluded. "Wait! Stop!" Engel cried as Gord's hand started to unbar the door. "Perhaps I was too quick in, counting the sum of your wealth." He thrust himself between customer and door, wringing his large, gnarly hands. Gord dangled his purse from his left hand, watching the dark eyes following its motion. "Let us bargain further, then," he said, turning back toward the counter. It took almost half an hour to come to a mutually acceptable price, and Gord was on the verge of walking out twice more before the dwarf finally yielded. Engel had tried his best to get the cat's-eye ring as part of the deal, but Gord had resisted. All the harder when the dwarf had reduced the number of gold orbs he also asked for in order to gain it. That made the young man very suspicious. The ring must have value beyond gold and gemstone, he thought. Eventually Gord paid over 6 orbs, all the gold he possessed. The dwarf was not interested in platinum, although the plates were more valuable than gold orbs by a tenth. Engel obviously cared much more about the yellow metal that his kind habitually favored. He was clutching the orbs fervently when Gord departed. Somehow Gord understood, for he was holding the haft of his new weapon tightly himself. It had cost him dearly to obtain it, and he would treasure it accordingly. He walked around the area for an hour or so thereafter, stopping in the meantime for some cold food and a flagon of ale at the local tavern, before returning to the marketplace. If anything, the market plaza was more crowded than it had been earlier. Gord was about to hurry through when his eyes were caught by a swatch of the brightly colored telltale garb of the Renée. Sure enough, there was Ada, intent on her study of the wares of a goldsmith's booth. He was merely going to pass without speaking, for he was certain she wouldn't notice him, when her posture alerted him that she was doing something other than browsing. He glanced at the jeweler and the others nearby, sized up the situation, and moved quickly to the girl's side. Sorry, it began to go down the line. Okay, now it's better. Don't bother with such inferior trash, Adas, my sweet. Gord smiled broadly as he said this and took the girl's arm in his hand. The motion concealed his deft removal of the earring she had slipped into her sleeve. Adas looked up at him, startled, then angry. Before she could utter a word, though, Gord was speaking loudly again. Let me see your selection, dear. He took her hand, and as if by magic the purloined jewelry was there. Just as I said, far too common and simple for someone so lovely. Gord tossed them to the startled owner, and the fellow barely caught them. Two other men who had been moving stealthily toward the Renée last also stopped short. Now then, fellow, let's see something good. Don't bother with stuff fit for that merchant's wives, Gord commanded. The goldsmith was taken aback, but he countered quickly. You don't have enough, he started, then caught himself and rewarded his objection. You didn't say what sum you'd pay. How can I select without knowing the depth of your purse? Gord ignored the impertinence. He pointed imperiously at the pair of small but brilliant rubies enmeshed in fine golden wire. Those, Smith, are more to our taste. Fetch them. The man brought them to Gord, as commanded, but while so doing he jerked his head toward the pair of stalwarts who served as his guards, and they moved to either side of Gord and Adas. The girl had finally caught the drift of what was going on. She moved closer to Gord, smiled wanly at him. Her olive skin appeared pale. Without seeming to notice the guards nearby, Gord carefully examined the earrings, allowing the slanting afternoon sunlight to play upon the sparkling facets of the gems, the rays turning them to fiery blazes of crimson. They are acceptable, but worth no more than a plate, he said as he stared at the proprietor of the booth, face set, eyes narrowed. A plate? Ha! A plate each, I say. Do you think me a dolt or an idiot? The fellow shouted back. The haggling began. Gord agreed too quickly to a price of 2 orbs, and over 2 lozenges of platinum received a pair of lackeys in return, still holding Adas by her shapely arm strode away. She said nothing, for she knew that Gord had saved her from being arrested for theft, but that he was furious over what the rescue had cost him. When she ran her free hand over his bicep, Gord didn't respond. End of chapter 11. So he lost a girl and gained 1. Wow! This book is very man-friendly. Not so much space for women, but I read that because Gygax wrote the book for a male audience, because it's an old book, different times. So another little break, and then we return to chapter 12. I think also today we read 4 chapters, I think. I have to find a position to read, because I read on my bed. I don't know why. That's true. Because my tables are all uncomfortable for this. And I have no table, no deck, no workbench. know anything for reading in front of the phone. But I have to find another position because this is very uncomfortable to me. I lost my leg one of these days. Okay, good. I am a bit, I am a lot tired. After that I sleep, I think. Okay, let's continue. Okay? Chapter 12. So, from the thief story to a pirate story. Radika's city was larger than Lukish, smaller than Greyhawk. Gord's family came to the principal place of County Ernst, along with a veritable fleet of barges. I don't know if it's Ernst or Arnst. I don't know. Ernst, Arnst. Having sailed from Lukish with 7 or 8 and then having met and been joined by many others. The convoy was for protection against the pirates who were known to ply the near dive between Lukish and Radika's city. And besides, the barge folk didn't have to worry about antagonizing anyone with this apparent show of force. The Countess of Ernst, who held sway over this principality, had no particular dislike of the Rene, as did Duke Harald, her cousin who ruled Duke Ernst. From what God could determine, the barge folk often received fees from her noble brilliancy for spying, intelligence, or actual services of a more military nature. God wasn't exactly sure of all that, for nobody spoke directly to the matter, and these questions were never answered. When the flotilla of barges came to a place near the capital city, they went up a small river mouth, a branch of the Artonsomei Skuret Delta, to Madich, a large village of some 800 or 900 souls. The Artonsomei is a famous river of earth. The visiting Rene always made a point of basing themselves at Madich and traveling overland to Radika's city, which was only a bit more than a league distant. Perhaps that explained part of the relative friendliness for them that County Ernstman evidences. Before they had taken leave of Lukish, Adad had been most attentive to Gord. He wasn't certain if the attention was born of gratitude or the fact that she wanted the ruby earrings which he had kept. But whichever it was, he didn't care. Despite all her overtures, Gord was only coolly polite. He had experienced all he ever wanted of Rene womenfolk with Estrella. When they put into Madich, Adad tried again to win him over, but Gord managed to slip quickly away. For the next several days, Gord explored Radagast, met and talked with its citizens, and covertly watched the less savory elements of the city at work and play. He would have engaged in some amusement and contributed to the city's economy, but the fact was, he was just about broke. The purchase of his dagger and the earrings, plus the orb he had grudgingly handed over to Miklos, left him with only about 4 plates to his name. Better off than most, and he realized that, but these days, unless Gord had more than a dozen plates in his purse, he considered himself strapped. Then an idea struck him, and he hurried back to the village where his family had set up camp. Gord found Adad at the edge of the village commons, watching a caravan of covered wains setting up there. When he asked her what was going on, her pretty face contorted into a scowl, and she spat. These dogs in the wagons claim to be Rene too, but they are at Loa, half-breed nothings, vagabonds, liars, and chicken stealers. Filing that away for future reference, Gord smiled and invited her to come with him for some fun in the city. They could leave early tomorrow and make a day of it, seeing what there was, eating, drinking, and who knew what. I would love it, she replied, but I have nothing to wear, and I feel so inferior because of it. A girl must look pretty, you know. Then Gygax gave him her most appealing glance, and God said that perhaps he'd have a gift for her when he picked her up in the morning. "If it is a nice present, perhaps we won't have to return tomorrow night," she said in a sultry voice. That it would be a nice present, God was certain. Returning or not was a matter to be determined by other than Gygax, except rather indirectly. She had better be prepared for quite a day, he mused. What God had in mind was allowing her to exercise her dubious talents as a pilferer while remaining in the background and using his own abilities. Thanks to the diversion she would provide, God should be able to have a field day. It was a cynical thing to do, but why not? He had become a rather cynical fellow, to say the least. Plotting, God strolled off to where he had established his place near the family camp of Michaels. Bright and early the next morning, he went to where he told Gygax to meet him, and sure enough she was there, smiling. He handed her the earrings. After being careful to keep her out of trouble during the morning, then plying her with wine and in the early afternoon, God led his unsuspecting decoy into the area of the city where gem merchants had their shops. Although the wares displayed close to where a thief could attempt snatch and run tactics were of little value, their glow and glitter were quite spectacular. Gygax was quickly enmeshed in the place, becoming filled with a growing desire to possess some of the beautiful stones that the pair was ogling in the shop windows. They actually entered one place and peered intently at the aquamarines, pearls, topazes, and similar stones there. The place had nothing of really exceptional value, but their visit served to further whet the girl's appetite for such baubles. They exited the shop and moved on a few paces. And then God told her that he remembered a brief errand they must take care of. Gygax should continue to enjoy herself by viewing the gemstones while God was gone for a bit. They could meet again at the end of the lane, only another few hundred feet up, in half an hour. Gygax really assented. After walking rapidly away and turning a nearby corner, God counted to 30 slowly, and then retraced his steps in a leisurely fashion. As he again rounded the corner, he saw Gygax entering a fairly large shop halfway down the lane. He continued in her direction in his most leisurely manner, taking special care to remain unnoticed. From a vantage point across the street, he watched the renegade girl examining the contents of the gem merchant's establishment. It appeared to be a fairly prosperous shop, although not the one he had hoped she would choose. Well, never mind, he would make the best of it. Gygax had been busy in the short time she'd been in the place, Gordon noted, as he strolled closer. There were quite a few different stones on the counter. And Gygax was pointing to her earrings and gesturing disdainfully at the loose gems. She was probably demanding to see larger rubies to match those on her ears. God turned partially away from the small glass panes of the shop window, pretending to watch the scattered traffic passing by. Perhaps awaiting someone, but surveying the interior of the shop out of the corner of his eye. After another few minutes, Gygax thought she had created a sufficiently confused situation, and acted. While she was decrying the terrible quality of the stones she had been shown, the girl used her hidden left hand to take a large spinel. The offended merchant didn't notice immediately, for by then the two were exchanging rather vile insults. As she marched in mock outrage for the door, however, the man came to his senses and took an inventory with his eyes. Of course he noticed that the spinel was not there, and he voiced an angry shout. Gygax broke into a run, and was outside the place as his owner vaulted over the counter, shouting at the top of his lungs. Because God stood to the right of the door, Gygax scooted left and away as fast as she could, not recognizing him in her haste to make good her theft and escape. God stayed planted as the shopkeeper came out and turned left in a hot pursuit. It reminded him of his old days in the slum quarter. And he chuckled softly to himself. Then he stepped into the shop, drew his dagger, and vaulted the counter. A large brownie youth, probably the owner's son or apprentice, was just coming through the curtain as Gord landed. The sound of Gord's pommel striking the unsuspecting fellow's head had a hollow sound, and the blow felled him like a steer at a slaughter. Empty head or not, it would be sore for the next few days. Took Gord, but he's alive. There was no time to fret about that anyway. Every second counted. As Gord had assumed he would do, the man had taken time to scoop all of his precious merchandise into an iron strongbox and lock it. He had the key with him, of course. The sounds from the lane nearby were growing louder and more frenetic. All was well still, but he would have to hurry. Gord took his weapon and thrust it against the hard metal of the lock. The point bit as if it were going into soft wood rather than cold iron. After a rapid succession of several such cuts, the lock was useless and the box open. Without bothering to select the better ones, Gord took as many stones as he could stuff into his shirt in a few seconds. Then he recrossed the counter and walked calmly out of the shop, heading away from the brawl, going on a few doors down. It seemed that some fishmonger passing this way on his journey home had run squarely into the jam merchant. The outrage of the latter at losing the thief who had robbed him was matched by that of the fishmonger, who was demanding to know who will pay for the split catch. Passers-by took sides, and the near riot was now in full swing. Shutters were being slammed and locked, doors barred. Calls for the patrol were passing down the streets roundabout. Gord was gone from the turmoil in less than a minute. He went to a tavern and enjoyed himself there. Then Gord headed for the down quarter of Radica City, an area where few questions were asked. The previous day, he'd seen a place that he thought would be perfect for his purpose. When his recognition signal was returned, Gord broke into thieves' cant, and soon the keeper of the place agreed to examine Gord's merchandise. The two retired toward the back room. Gord examined the entrance carefully before going in, and scrutinized the room itself even more thoroughly for secret doors or floor traps once he was inside, before settling down to the business at hand. All of this made the fans grin, for he appreciated professionalism in those he dealt with. They soon struck an agreeable price. Two of the man's assistants fetched his money box. He paid Gord, and that was that. Gord had been careful to have the fellow retain a tithe for the local guild. Whether he paid it or kept it was his business, but Gord will never be in trouble on that score. Guildmasters had a way of learning the truth, and they seldom used spells to gain such information. With a fresh half-score of orbs, as well as a sort of loose change to boot, Gord felt much better. Now he was solvent again. Time to get on with the rest of it. Whistling a merry tune, Gord went out the northernmost gate of the city, rather than the southeastern one, which led to Madich. Just as darkness was falling, he came upon a gypsy wagon, its driver lounging beside it. After a brief conversation, Gord clambered into the vehicle. The driver clucked the team of horses into motion, and the wagon rolled along the road on its way to who knew where. He go away. Bye. I like his way to live. I have a woman. Nah, left her alone. 1 week and 50 leagues later, Gord and his new acquaintances were camped in the rich grasslands of the Ayrton-Seimei River Valley. These Rene, or Atlois, according to the prejudiced view of the Birch folk, were much the same as their lake-faring cousins, only a bit wilder and roguer. In fact, Gord would never have trusted such folk, save for the fact that he was an adopted Rene, knew their speech, and actually looked similar to these people. Besides, he had paid them well in gems, although with the smallest and least valuable sort, for their help in his scheme and the subsequent conveyance of his person away from Radica City. Gord was frankly happy to be away from the water, but he was sore and stiff. Riding a horse was no simple thing, and his lessons were painful. These wagon-born Rene were horse breeders, among other occupations such as thievery, tinkering, and entertaining. This wilderness place was one of their grazing areas, and there were 100 or so horses with the band. The fall crop had been good, and all the animals were in splendid condition. They would be moved to the Great Northern Band area in another week, and selected horses would be sold at the annual fair and horse market there. That was where God planned to leave the gypsy train and seek his fortune elsewhere. Meanwhile, however, he practiced his riding, played at fencing with exceptionally able swordsmen of the group, and even learned the use of the crossbow. He had no intention of lugging around one of these small missile weapons favored by the wagon folk, but God decided it would be useful if he knew how to operate a crossbow in a tight situation, such as when the barge had nearly been wrecked by the monstrous creature from the depths of Near-Dev. The journey was unhurried, for they stopped at every village and hamlet to offer services, perform, trade, and occasionally make off with some unguarded livestock or goods. God noted that these Rene were most prudent in exercising thievery. Since this was a road they regularly traveled, the gypsies were careful to give the inhabitants of their stopping places no reason to feel hostility toward them. They tinkered, traded sharply, sold questionable remedies, and stole all the small things that made them exciting and dark visitors, not threatening ones. When they sang, danced, told fortunes, juggled, made their trained animals perform, and otherwise entertained, a bit of dishonesty could be forgiven. Each rustic felt that it was his or her business to be on guard against minor pilfering and poultry theft when the wagon folk came. After all, they brought news, excitement, and a virtual carnival with them each time they passed through an area. The fair was held outside the walled town of Caporna. At fair time, the town's 6,000 or so inhabitants served as hosts for travelers from all around the place. For the duration of the month-long event, the population inside the walls was nearly twice normal, and thousands more camped outside the town. Gord and the gypsies arrived at the outskirts of Caporna some 3 weeks after they had left the vicinity of Radica's city. In a few days, the festival that opened the event will be underway, and everyone in the train was busy preparing for the upcoming demands. Having nothing of the like to concern himself with, Gord took the opportunity to improve his horsemanship while seeing a bit of the countryside. He had pretty well covered the area around Caporna and spent a goodly amount of time within the town proper as well, when he discovered another encampment of wagon folk. Their practice astounded the young man, for they were tumblers and acrobats. From the smallest child to the grey-bearded lord of the train, each and every one had some contribution to make it to a breathtaking performance. After a nose-struck Gord stood gawking at their rehearsal for a time, one of their number came up to him and suggested that Gord move on. Free shows were not a part of their offering. The man told Gord rather curtly, and he'd soon be able to view their wonders properly during the fair. Having dressed himself in clothing other than that worn by the Rene, Gord was not particularly recognizable as an adopted member of the folk, nor could anyone seeing him have guessed that he was a master beggar, or had at least been one once. Gord conveys respect to the man in the patois of the wagon folk, and topped it off with the secret signs of both beggars and thieves. The muscular performer who had appeared to show away a non-paying spectator now served as his emissary to the leader of the group, and soon Gord was being given warm greetings and cool wine. After bidding adieu to his traveling companions of the last few weeks, and paying a bit too much for the mount he had selected from them, Gord shifted from one camp of gypsies to another. He was determined to learn more of the feats he had seen performed. Although he had revealed himself as an adopted member of the barge folk, these Rene were quick enough to drop their prejudices and accept Gord. It did not hurt a bit that he had gifted the lord of the encampment with fine wine from Caporna. Gord offered to teach the gypsies some of his skills in thievery in return for the instruction he would receive in the arts of acrobatics. There was little time for such interplay during the hustle and bustle of the fair, but when the festivities concluded at good month's commencement, Gord would be told and would himself instruct as the band moved on in its travels. Having nothing specific to do during the fair did not keep Gord from enjoying himself. In fact, he thought it a great joke, stealing from the thieves of Caporna. The weeks of fairy time passed swiftly, and although he had little teaching during this time, Gord managed to pick up some skills just by watching, for he was already quite accomplished at climbing and balance, prerequisites for successful thievery of the more subtle sort. Thus encouraged, he spent more time in town and devised a scheme he was certain would reap dividends. He again posed as a rich, somewhat foolish young fop. He allowed himself to be set up for a swindling operation that the Caporna thieves put into action, thinking him an easy mark. He had passed himself off as a connoisseur of art and a collector of statuettes and objects of similar nature. He was tested with the offer of a dubious piece, as he knew he would be, and dashed the hopes of the swindlers who had been expecting an easy profit by disdainfully rejecting the valuable item. Then, as Gord had also anticipated, the swindlers tried to get the better of him with the old bait-and-switch routine. The thieves took him to an exclusive shop, which Gord recognized immediately as a phony setup filled with goods from the storehouses of the thieves, and whatever fancy was also on discount. Gord readily waxed enthusiastic over several of the splendid pieces they had, but then he was ushered out. No sense in making a hasty purchase, or so his friends recommended. They promised to meet him again the next day, and they would return to the warehouse to make a final decision, by which time, Gord knew, cheap duplicates would be ready to pack in boxes. But there was no waiting till the morrow. That night Gord entered the shop from the roof, aided by several of his new gypsy friends. He regretted having to kill a guard, but that was part of the business. Gord stayed out of Caporna altogether after that night, and he appeared only as a renegade man when he went anywhere beyond the gypsies' camp. The gypsy train that left at the end of the great fair held far more wealth in its wagons than anyone would have expected, and Gord, the one the acrobats had to thank for this new affluence, rode along as their leader's right-hand man. End of chapter 12. Okay, we read the last chapter, the 13, and after that we stop and we continue Monday. Whew. So, not an honest fellow, this Gord, not a typical hero. He's a rogue, indubitably. He's a real rogue, and a great character. It's pretty curious that one of the first books of Dungeons and Dragons have as a protagonist a great character. Not good, not evil, gray, realistic. This is the geniality, I think, the genius of Gygax, who invented Dungeons and Dragons and all Grey Oak. Something that is lost nowadays. Grey Oak is a particular setting, not an epic fantasy like Forgotten Realms or Middle Earth. It's a grim, dark, smelly setting. There is good in Grey Oak, but there is also black, there is also evil in Grey Oak, and there is a lot of grey. A lot of neutral characters, heroes. They are not really heroes, they are men who try to survive the day or became rich with treasures in tombs. That is Grey Oak. Pretty different from the most notorious Forgotten Realms. So, last chapter of today, chapter 13, is pretty short, only 7 pages, so we can finish early, I think. Let's start. Chapter 13. As the horsemen stayed atop the low rise and galloped into a clearing bathed in moonlight, several quarrels buzzed and hummed past mount and rider. The man crouched lower, and his horse seemed to jump ahead with a burst of new speed. In seconds, they were lost in the thick shadows of the trees beyond. A dozen steel-capped warriors followed the fleeing rider through the moonlit meadow, and likewise disappeared in the darkness beyond. Then the pounding of hooves faded into the night, and the place was peaceful again. Insects resumed their chores, and the rustling of small animals making their nocturnal rounds could be heard by a careful listener. Nearby, a giant owl voiced its deep, mournful hooting. A moment later, the shrill cry of captured prey split the serenity for an instant. Fortunately for Gord, he was not being hunted by such sure predators as the denizens of the forest were, and he managed to elude his pursuers in the dense woodlands. But he and his stallion were very tired, but Gord knew they must press on through most of the night, so that when the sun rose, those tracking him would not find their quarry nearby. Dismounted, careful to be as silent as possible, the young outlaw led his steed southwest, going ever deeper into the heart of the Nether wood. Utilizzing rocky ground, a small rivulet that fed into the Yall to the north, and every other device he could think of to throw off the soldiers who dogged him, Gord plodded onward. Sometime after midnight, he finally came to a dingle where he decided to camp. The stallion fell to grazing immediately as Gord unsaddled the tired animal and flopped down himself, exhausted. He dozed until first light, and then was up and moving again. Gord walked the horse until they found a place to drink. There, he refreshed himself with a quick splash, ate a handful of iron rations, and topped his breakfast off with a bunch of peppery watercress that grew in the stream. Feeling far better, he mounted and urged the stallion into a trot. Perhaps today he will finally lose his pursuers permanently. The troop of soldiers chasing him were servants of his faithfulness, the Canon of Redmod, a town of no particular note near the heartland of the theocracy of the Pale. When Gord had left Redmod, he had wanted simply to put as much distance between that place and himself as his courser could manage. He had not dreamed that the Canon would send his minions on so long a chase, for it was now nearly 2 weeks since his departure, and the soldiers were hounding him still. Gord wondered if their doggedness was because of the golden reliquary he had taken from the cleric's temple, or whether it was because of his familiarity with his faithfulness daughter, Liked. She had shown him a few things, all right. No matter, either way, whatever their motivation, the outcome would be the same if he were caught by the troop of avenging riders. As he rode, Gordon recalled the events of the past few months. From the Great Bend area, the gypsies had taken their horses southward. The train had passed slowly through County Ernst during the month of Harvester, celebrated Brewfest at Trigot, and then crossed the Franz River just above the city of Guildsford. Autumn was spent moving on southward again through the kingdom of Nearond, past Woodwich, to the land between the Downtide River and the Celadon Forest, where they wintered near the town of Beetu. During this whole time, Gord had been given intensive training in the art of acrobatics, and soon he was tumbling, leaping, vaulting, and even walking the taut rope with the best of the apprentices. Of course, during the same period, he was in turn teaching his adopted family members the fine points of his own crafts. While the wagon folk were as able as their water-loving kin in performing minor pilferage and thievery, Gord was instructing them on a higher level, and they were apt pupils. With the end of Fire's sixth shell, the wagons began rolling northward again, making for the Flinty Hills, far distant, before going on to Mid-Meadow for Glowfest, from there to be bound for the annual fair at Radicus City. It was at Mid-Meadow that Gord parted company with the train, but not with all of his Renee friends. 2 adventuresome young Renee accompanied him on a foray into the theocracy, the threesome bent on reliving the prosperous palish of some palish of some of their material treasures. The adventure had begun well enough. Equipped as they were with the finest mounts from the gypsy herd, the three were soon far away from mid-medio and well into the Pale. Here they robbed an incautious merchant traveling a back road, their wealthy tradesmen. In the towns they used more subtle arts to relieve their victims of excess coinage, and in such places Gord and his fellows also utilized their acrobatic skill to perform daring feats of burglary. The Polish were not, however, much impressed with such applications of the profession of thievery, holding the activity in disrepute and giving no license to any association or guild that allowed such practice. Therefore, the trio stayed but a little time in any one place. The blending of the races here, Oeridian and Flan, with a bit of blonde swell cropping up here and there, made the Polish a robust and handsome folk. Although their bent was such that they tended toward propriety and soberness, and tenaciously adhered to the teachings of Pholtus, the Polish did have their moments of levity and celebration too. They were intelligent, industrious, and togue. All told, God found them interesting, if a bit dull, but they were also quite prosperous and tended to be easy marks, for there were few thieves among them. Stealing was punishable by death, then again, so were most other honorable pastimes, such as seduction. The threesome spent a few days in the town of Augsburg, a city actually for it had well over 10,000 inhabitants, although it was an unsophisticated place at best. They then put the peaks of the rakers behind them and rode north and west along the road to Wintersheven, for their purses were full for the moment. The capital city of the theocracy was too sober a place, however, and from there the three had travelled southward again, ending up in Redmond. There God and his two companions settled down for rest, relaxation, and whatever revelry they could find. Despite the veil of devoted service they wore, the local populace was ready enough for surreptitious activities of the frivolous and licentious sort, as the small but active Bawdy district soon demonstrated to the newcomers. While young men with silver to spend were welcome indeed, and soon the three of them were minor celebrities. The lionization did go to their heads a bit, God admitted to in self-reflection, so that they became incautious in their talk. While they did not actually tell anyone that they planned to rob the temple, they did plenty of bragging about how rich they soon would be. What transpired after they broke into the strong room of the place and made off with the treasury that the canon had so rigorously extorted from the faithful was not surprising, reflected God, considering their carelessness. Beautiful light had been the key to the success of their haste, of course, and God thought that her fury at being left behind when they made off with the loot was probably the measure spur to the pursuit, which even now continued. He had promised to take the canon's daughter along when they left Redmond, and so she had told God all about the location of the treasure and about the magical protections that warded the amassed contributions, which, once pilfered, would enable them to journey elsewhere in high style. How could she really have thought that three hard-riding thieves could carry along a soft female? Her presence would have made their capture certain within a day or two, for someone other than she could have described the trio to the angry canon and his men-at-arms, and they would be as conspicuous as could be if they tried to travel with a female. God was certain that the light had described him as completely as anyone could have, and had spurred him on. He had no means of disguise at hand, so his only recourse was to get clear of the Pale as rapidly as possible. This he had been seeking to do for days now, but the cursed soldiers trailing him made it difficult indeed. The three had split up as soon as they discovered that the company of horsemen was in hot pursuit. All that resulted from this move was a division of the troop following into three separate squadrons. Each group was a dozen or more strong, and each man was equipped with lance, crossbow, and shield. God never considered an attempt to thin their numbers by ambush, for what chance did he have against such soldiers? Certainly, a well-spun bullet from his sling might have some effect, but retributive missiles and close pursuit would make such attack the act of folly. Evading them and outdistancing them were utmost in God's mind. Evidently, his pursuers desired quite the opposite. As the heroine began to be cut by gullies and the landscape rolled downward toward the Yell River ahead, Gard turned on a more southerly course and spurred his horse to a canter so as to avoid being cocked against the water. From what he had heard about this forest, Gard was none too comfortable traveling within its depths. The place was reputed to hide all sorts of nasty creatures and humanoid brigands, not to mention the bandits said to infest the woodland. Perhaps these tales were the stuff used to keep small children at home. However, for the horseman on his tail had not hesitated in following when he had plunged into the trees, and the day of traveling amidst the forest had not brought him face to face with anything more fearsome than a smallish bear and many small animals of the sort one would expect to encounter in such a setting. Near sunset, Gord led his steed through the shallow verge of a nasty-looking marsh that spread out to the west as far as he could see. Just as the swollen crimson orb of the sun sank below the horizon, he came out of the morass, remounted, and rapidly rode due south. This left the dangerous lowland far behind. By the time full darkness swathed the trees in gloom. There would be no way for those who still might be at his heels to locate where he had left the marsh until daylight came. Gord dismounted and walked on warily alert for danger, seeking a sheltered spot to sleep. A gleam of flickering yellow light alerted him that there were others ahead. Gord dropped his stallion's reins on the ground, patted the animal's neck, and told it in a whisper to remain silent until he came back. The courser seemed to understand, for it wickered softly, nodded its great head, and fell to searching for green growth amidst the tree roots. Gord crept stealthily toward the firelight. It was quite difficult to move silently, for the forest floor was covered with a scattering of dead leaves and dry twigs hidden by new growth, but Gord was adept at stealth. Only the faintest of sounds marked his approach to the source of the illumination. He was soon close enough to see that there were two small bonfires, and by their dancing light Gord noted that some 24 men, bandits, judging by their dress and weapons, were scattered in the glen, preparing their food and readying for the night. They were a scurvy lot in motley armor, and garbed drawn from all nations and races, it seemed, for Gord saw several orcish and elfish half-breeds among them. On the far side of the encampment were 6 or 8 horses. There were piles of goods near them, so Gord figured that the animals were used to carry captured spoils. These men must be returning to their base of operations, for the heap of stuff near the horses was sufficient to burden them all. Gord stayed in a crouch and began to creep slowly backward, for he had seen enough. Then a heavy weight fell upon his back, pinning him to the ground, and the sharp spear point pressed against his neck. "Don't move!" a rough voice hissed. "One sound, and you are dead." End of chapter 13, with a climax this time. So, what's gonna happen? I don't know, but we discover it Monday evening at 6 o'clock, I think. 5, 6 o'clock, I think. We continue with another 3, 4 chapters. I don't really know. But, well, for today is all. Have a nice evening, dinner, night, everything, whatsoever. And to the next time. Bye.